Revolutionary Girl Utena should not be thought of as a puzzle that you have to solve by finding all the pieces and slotting them into the holes, but rather it should be thought of as a very detailed portrait. One that's so detailed, in fact, that some viewers can't quite tell what it is, but there is purpose in putting so much detail into it. While a smiley face may portray the same core emotion as a picture of an actual smiling face, the latter also has nuance, more to be interpreted and gained, more said about the person to whom the face belongs, etched into every line and pore and follicle. A smiley face interpretation of Utena's core message might be that love is worth dying for. Even still, the series is not so much fixated on love, which is portrayed pretty simplistically therein, but on the challenges of love. So a smiley face interpretation of what the show is actually out to showcase might be how cynicism is the enemy of love. But these broad terms such as love and cynicism are only the white beams of light which smash into the prism of the show's structure, and then are refracted into a rainbow of disambiguation. To invent a term for Utena's narrative structure, I would call it prismatic storytelling. I can't wear this anymore, it's too hot. I think it's more than fair to say that Utena is not a plot-driven show, considering how the plot is almost completely obscured until its final arc, largely inconsequential up to that point, and if it moves at all, it does so at a glacial pace. It's more tempting to consider it character-driven, as each arc presents us with one of the three acts in the individual narratives of its central cast, and yet even still, these characters are not so complex, nor do they develop so heavily, that I could go so far as to call them rich or detailed in the way that I might describe the cast of, say, Neon Genesis Evangelion, even though I would describe the show itself that way. The series is heavily fixated on aesthetics, to such an extent that it could be seen as deliberately breaking away from the characters and plot to showcase what could be considered unrelated details. It is leaden with obvious and direct symbolism, poetic metaphor, and no shortage of hilarious sight gags, all of which have a point, but whose point isn't necessarily different from the point that's already being made by the story. Repetition is a core component of Utena in ways obvious and not. This is, after all, a tale as old as time, so much so that fairy and folktale iconography are but two of the classical media forms which are incorporated into its aesthetic. It's a show that repeats itself constantly, not only in literally reused scenes and a rigidly followed episodic structure, but in a moment-to-moment sense. The shadow puppet scenes are retranslations of each episode's thematic message, as are the lyrics to the battle themes, as are the use of flower language when it comes up, or the uses of fashion and musical motifs, etc. Which is why I must emphasize that Utena is not a puzzle. It is not a picture whose meaning is obscured when you can't grasp all of its cryptic symbols or lyrics. Those things are merely extra lines which add detail to the already existing picture. All of this is in service of conveying those core themes as thoroughly as possible, from as many lenses and vantage points as the creators can provide. It seems to instruct you, if thinking about it this way isn't helping you understand, then think about it this other way instead. It makes me think of the Japanese phrase, sono kanji, used when describing something metaphorically and then saying, it's that kind of feeling. You can get it without literally saying what it is. Mr. Beatung said once that art is irreducible, and I agree. To attempt to boil Utena down into a singular interpretation, or even to try and ascribe specific meanings to every little detail in the show, would be to do exactly what the phrase boiled down implies, evaporating away much of its substance. If I can say anything for sure about Utena, it's that the series was meant to be open to interpretation on every conceivable level. The point of it was never for you to take away a singular message or thought, but to take away whatever you might happen to get. And the creators have gone out of their way to give you as many chances to take something as possible. As such, I think it would wrong both the creators and the audience of this show to try and claim to have solved it. Just as a term such as love is so vague and multidimensional as to be unhelpful in getting you closer to understanding the show, stopping the buck at my own realizations may well cut you off from your own discoveries. My purpose here is not so much to explain the show, or even to give you the tools to do so yourself, but merely to compare notes. I will show you what I pulled from it personally, no more and no less. I may be aware, for instance, that Nanami's dress in episode 3 is meant to resemble a certain flower, and that the language of this flower is relevant to the sequence in which the dress is worn, but since I don't know anything about flower language, I'm not going to try and explain it any further than that. I can tell you that the dress gives me a sinister yet beautiful feeling, like it embraces the emotional thrill and pleasure of avarice, and even that I just love it for reasons which I'm sure have grounding in color theory, but since I'm not studied in color theory, that's as far as I will go with this particular example. I'm also not going to bother with any qualitative analysis of the series, as it's more than 20 years old and widely regarded as a classic. You should watch it and form your own opinions, and if you're afraid to spend 39 episodes with it, you can compare no shortage of consumer reviews that already exist on the internet. It's understandable how the dialogue surrounding Utena tends to focus on themes and symbolism, as these are the things it has which are missing from so much anime. What the show has to say about identity, and its references to classical art forms, and the very unique aesthetic presentation of the series will be massive draws to an audience craving those things. But just as integral to my enjoyment of the series is moments like this. Or this. Or this. Or this. More than anything else, Revolutionary Girl Utena is playful. When one of its chief messages is be yourself, it's only appropriate that the Baepapa's team was being as much of themselves as possible when creating it, not just in the incorporation of bizarre and imaginative humor, but also in making references to many things which the creators seem to enjoy. Unless someone on the team was a huge fan of 1970s experimental Japanese cinema, for instance, you probably wouldn't expect them to have J.A. Caesar compose all of the incredible battle themes. Likewise, if the show wasn't indeed indebted to anime history in itself, there wouldn't be references to shows like Mobile Suit Gundam, and even the then new Neon Genesis Evangelion, whose director Hideaki Anno was friends with Utena director Kunihiko Ikuhara at the time. This too is an element of prismatic construction, the creators taking themselves as that singular beam of light and looking inward to see which collection of colors is being jumbled inside of them to create their specific hue. There's a pervasive sense in the series that nothing was left off the table. It's not unfair to say that Revolutionary Girl Utena is a show about everything. It takes place in a high school, but only because it treats high school as a microcosm of society, a small world which has its own so-called end. Everything that the show deals with is so much bigger than a school, and yet what better way to formulate a small cast that includes children, young adults, and fully grown adults in close proximity and figuring out how they affect one another. If the functions of society can be described in terms of how all these human relationships play against each other, then the fixation on relationships in this show can be looked at as describing society far beyond the confines of just a high school. Yet also the school is a metaphor representing stagnation, a place with strict rules and adherence to those in how the socialization becomes formatted. The metaphor is functional because Chairman Akio insists that this school places independent thought at the forefront of its priorities, yet there inherently is nothing independent about a system built to service a huge number of people. The four-arc structure of the show is very deliberate as well. Aside from how the first one narratively functions by introducing us to each character's basic strengths and weaknesses and slowly immersing us into the setting and relationships, it also feels somewhat secure in how it basically resembles a magical girl show. In the second arc, the entire tone shifts. The colors are darker, more scenes seem to be set at dusk, and there's a switch from following constructive characters to destructive ones. Even still, the third arc gets darker, with many of its scenes at night and the sometimes disturbing sexual content continuing to ratchet higher in intensity. Fukaku. Motto fukaku. Deeper and deeper, the show continually drills down into the heart of its characters and the world they inhabit. First we learn how things are, then we start to know why, and then the answers to more difficult questions become more complicated and harder to represent or interpret. More and more, the resolutions are opaque and emotions more tortured and veiled. As we approach bedrock, it becomes more and more of a struggle on all fronts, for the characters, for the show itself to represent them, and for us to completely understand. Because again, it would be a disservice to these feelings to state them plainly. Powerful emotions aren't something that you can just translate straight into words and think, okay, I get it now, your problem is this, and so the solution must be this. Just like it would be a gross oversimplification for me to say something like, I got bullied as a kid and now I find it hard to communicate with people, when the reality is that every single experience I have ever had has shaped me in ways which are just as specific as how exactly those events played out, the answers don't come just as easily as Juri was betrayed by her friend and that's why she's reticent to communicate. Utena wants to portray something that can't be boiled down or even grasped so easily, and as such, it might not always be satisfying or even meaningful to every viewer. I came away from certain episodes feeling like I never really understood why a character made the decision that they did, but also not feeling as though that decision was incorrect or out of character to be portrayed the way that it was. After all, the vast majority of actions which I witness others taking in real life are illogical in my view, and nearly everything I've ever done is definitely illogical to most people. I think it's in preservation of this confusion that the story in Utena is kind of told backwards. The most important motivations are veiled until the final arc, and even then are drenched in vagueness. In particular, the decisions made by Anthy and Akio probably required the meditation of experiencing everything up to that point to resonate with the audience. And even still, I don't know if the story was ever clear enough with its intentions to have as much impact as it might have. The Apocalypse of Adolescence film, which retells the story in a wholly different way, is kind of like a reversal on the show itself. Whereas the show is clearer about what exactly is going on and why, it is less clear about how you're meant to take it. By comparison, the film practically beats you over the head with a message about graduating adolescence by seizing freedom and casting aside the fear of authority, but everything else about the film is vastly more obtuse and uninviting about what is being symbolized. It's as though while the show existed to feed you as many variable opportunities to get something unique from the experience as possible, the film instead offers you one huge freebie and then dares you to try and unscramble the impressionistic interpretations of experiences from the core of the creative team's minds that is the rest of the film. I think a lot of power is given to the imagery and themes of this series by way of them being painted with a broad enough brush to have widespread application. That is to say, for instance, that in presenting us a character as unique as Akio, whose role as chairman of the school isn't exactly relatable to any real way that we've seen a school headmaster acting, yet has shades of every single way that an older, authoritative figure can manipulate and abuse the younger people around him, we are able to project any number of applications onto him, from figures such as older siblings, fathers, and teachers, to guidance counselors, or even broad ideas like an entire corrupted patriarchal society. I don't think any reading is necessarily better or more complete than any other, but I do think that the series wants to guide your thinking in certain ways to avoid narrowing it down to anything overly obvious. For instance, the false dichotomy of male and female is utterly obliterated as often as possible. Traits which are commonly thought of as masculine or feminine are given to characters of all genders, even as the symbolism of those traits in and of themselves are kept intact. For instance, it would be very easy to read the series as a screed against what some refer to as toxic masculinity. Akio, who is a man, most embodies this in how he controls and puts down the people around him, especially women, and he is leaden with what we might see as the worst traits of men, as well as so many symbols of what men are prone to idealize, from the badass sports car to the insane recklessness to the fact that he puts his cock into nearly every single other character in the show. But Akio doesn't exhibit these traits exclusively, nor do only male characters. Utena's wrong-headed idea of chivalry and princehood, for instance, is also criticized. After all, these traits are only called toxic masculinity because men are more prone to them, even though they aren't traits somehow unique to men's physiology or social experience. Likewise, to behave under society's expectations of womanhood is treated like a sort of death knell for Utena during her darkest moments at the back end of the series. But traits commonly associated with either of these genders are also celebrated as they appear in characters of both. Sayonji's pride and sensitivity are first shown at their worst and paint him as the absolute worst kind of guy, and yet by the end we have to acknowledge some ways in which his mentality can be admirable. Miki is congratulated when he embraces his more feminine side instead of trying to force himself to be masculine. Many of Juri's problems come from her fear of revealing her emotions or weakness, while Toga, who at first refers to himself as a feminist in the most ironic way imaginable, eventually has his worldview shaken by his loss to Utena, and must also become become someone who can put his faith in the feminine to advance. All of this is to say that there are some traits which Revolutionary Girl Utena seeks to criticize and others which it seeks to congratulate, as well as acknowledgement of how society tends to think of these traits and ascribe them to these traditionally understood gender roles, even with symbolism which directly paints them in the way that they tend to crop up within society. But underneath all of that is a rejection of the notion that any of these traits are inherently tied to gender, and much more importance is placed on presenting characters who exhibit unique combinations of these traits in realistic ways, exploring them without fear. It is, of course, direly important that the majority of the cast is presented as at least bisexual, frequently androgynous, and very openly sexualized. It's also no accident that one of the battle themes is literally a battle cry for hermaphroditism as the sort of final form of humanity. Again, though, I'd be hard-pressed to boil down any singular message that this show has about the queer or gender non-binary experience. What I know of director Kunihiko Ikuhara as a person is that I have a picture of him dressed like Sailor Mars, and what I know about myself as a person is that if my fiancé were to cosplay as Anthy Himemiya, I would want to cosplay as Utena Tenjo myself alongside of her. None of these facts tells you anything about either of us other than we think gender is something fun to play around with, and Utena presents doing so almost as necessity towards a more complete sense of self. If you ask me, one of the biggest problems facing human identity is feeling the need to define yourself in a set of parameters or terms on the basis of trying to qualify the definitions of your personal set of traits. Viva androgyny indeed. Earlier I mentioned that Utena seems to state that the enemy of love is cynicism, and if I were to change the color of that statement, I would clarify that the enemy of progress is norms. Sexual or gender norms are far from the only ones that Utena has a problem with, but they are at the forefront because they are so striking, pertinent, and immediate as to affect literally every single person on Earth, and also because that very fact draws our attention to it. There's just as much to say about how people perceive themselves as normal and how that perception in itself limits or drags them down. And moreover, the show is not out to admonish anyone for their abnormality, no matter how alien they might be to society. Even incest is explored in depth, not for shock value, but with a sincere hope to understand and cope with it. Another core tenet of the series, which may be harder to grasp as it isn't so often a part of this conversation, is the critique of memory as the basis of identity. Anyone who's studied memory or even basic psychology knows that memory is insanely fallible, constantly reconstructed, easily manipulated, and frequently misunderstood. And yet so much of our understanding of ourselves and our world inevitably relies on it. Utena is adamantly against anyone dwelling on the past or getting lost in memories instead of re-examining them and coming to new conclusions over the course of their personal evolution. How it handles this will be easier to talk about as we begin to dive into more specific examples on our journey through the nitty-gritty of this show. One more noteworthy facet of the series to touch on before we really get going here is, again, repetition. Not just as an aspect of the series, but as something to be commented on in itself. The acknowledgement of how history is constantly repeating itself, of the stagnation inevitably experienced within our systems that are built to perpetuate themselves, and the change which only ever comes in small and steady ways when little pieces break away. After all, the victory achieved at the very end of the series is just when Utena sacrifices herself in the name of love so that Anthy can finally move on with her life and do something new. As with many stories, the quickest way into the bones of Utena is through an examination of its protagonist. And if by this we mean the one primarily responsible for propelling the story forward, this means to study Akio. While the titular character may undoubtedly be the main one, Utena's role in the story remains entirely reactive up until the very end, when she finally makes the one crucial decision that defines how the story ends. But Akio's manipulation lies behind every single moving part of the story up until that point. So let's examine him. Akio and his sister Anthy's backstory is probably best understood to be purely metaphorical. How it could have actually transpired in light of the series ostensibly taking place in the real world isn't even worth asking ourselves, and I think it's exactly for this reason that we don't learn said story until the show is nearly over, and when we could already have a good enough sense of exactly who Akio and Anthy are, and how this backstory makes sense as a logical starting point for their current attitudes, even if it doesn't make literal sense in the context of reality. reality. Once upon a time, Akio was a prince whose purpose in life was to protect all of the girls in the world. Because this prince existed, every girl in the world was a princess. However, the long-term effort of protecting all these girls eventually took a physical toll on the prince. While the prince might have simply gone on fighting until he was dead of his own accord, his sister Anthe felt it was unfair that he should suffer for everyone else's sake, and so she protected him and told everyone that he was dead. In retaliation, the populace declared her a witch and sentenced her to an eternal torture before the blades of 1,000,000 swords. Witnessing this reaction caused Akio's mind to split. One part of him, which still wanted to play the role of the altruistic prince, was locked away inside of a castle, waiting for someone to come along who could embody him once more. Akio himself, meanwhile, completely lost faith in humanity, coming to the conclusion that they were not meant to be saved, but controlled and ruled. Even still, however, he craves to have the princehood returned to him, as therein he believes is the power to revolutionize the world. Both of Akio's ideologies are simply too extreme. As the prince, he offered salvation without any effort and inevitably worked himself to death. You know the saying, give a man a fish and you'll feed him for a day, teach a man to fish and he'll eat for the rest of his life. Also, if you keep giving everyone fish, eventually you're just going to be doing nothing but fishing all the time and you probably can't catch enough fish to give them to everyone, so just stop doing that and teach them. Akio's faith in humanity was demolished so heavily that he cannot teach them with sincerity. Even though he promotes some of the right values, his understanding of those values is tainted. He teaches others to take control of their lives, to seize the wheel, but in the unhealthiest of terms, where they do not work with others to achieve their goals, but instead victimize and control others to have what they demand. His justification for his mode of thinking is pure cynicism. At one point he even says, "I'm not the one who causes it, the world does." He believes that the human heart is such a tainted thing that the only way to handle it is with force. Akio's construction of power is perfectly encapsulated in the Rose Bride, someone absolutely necessary to grant the power of revolution to a duelist, yet utterly subservient to and under that duelist's control. Akio is not interested in teamwork, but control, and he only offers the illusion of teamwork to others in service of manipulating them to follow his plans. He believes himself a guiding light with all of the answers, a man who's cracked the code on what human beings are and how to fix them, even though he leaves the very person he's meant to be out to protect, his sister Anthe, horribly tormented in his wake. He and Anthe share the belief that in the end, girls are all rose brides, seeming to mean anyone who isn't a player, who isn't at least in the game to become the #1 player that there is, the Ubermensch alpha male. In some of my old videos about light novels, I used to talk about how so often the female lead is positioned as the second strongest hero in the show, someone who would be the strongest if not for the fact that the male lead is even stronger and therefore always to her rescue. This is how Akio wants Utena. He wants her at her most powerful, better than any other warrior besides himself, and then stripped of her agency to function as only the ultimate sword for him to wield. There is no partnership between them, as there had been for Utena and Anthe, who in the final arc arrive in the arena together, where Anthe actually draws Utena's own inner strength out of her for her to wield into battle, instead of giving her her own strength. From the second arc onwards, Akio is frequently depicted spewing aphorisms into an innocent Utena's brain, all of which sound okay on paper, but are easily broken down in that they don't have universal application. Everything he says sounds generically mature, but only insofar as it is a cynical worldview derived from knowing more than an innocent conception of the world, yet in ignorance or lack of acceptance of the ways in which human beings still have the power to do good. It's as though he's become so jaded that he thinks not being jaded is childishness. Akio's most pathetic attacks on altruism come during his final battle with Utena, in which he unleashes an onslaught of accusations against her resolution. He suggests to her that because she has committed a sin, she is now nothing more than a sinner. That because she had a moment of weakness, it isn't within her to be as strong as she has to be. This perfectly reflects how Akio's faith in humanity was so completely shattered by the one way in which he was personally fucked over. After that moment, it was as though anything altruistic that anyone does were merely a momentary flash amid their otherwise regular state of uncaring. Even if this mentality isn't correct, it is nonetheless powerful and couched in a legitimate, if limited, understanding of human nature. In fact, his understanding really is so powerful that the only thing he stops short of knowing is the one thing which will undo him in the end. It is because he knows people so well that manipulating them comes easily. and it helps that most of whom he's dealing with is young, susceptible minds, and that he is so deft with language. He gets to his victims by selling them easily achieved, emotionally gratifying values to fill in the gaps of their confused minds. That is to say, finding people who are lost and giving them simple directions. He does this most often through appealing to their libidos and their identities. What Akio preaches constantly is willpower, and yet he doesn't really believe in it, which is exactly why he fails. Akio seems to think that the only way he can become powerful enough to revolutionize the world is through a power he doesn't possess, that if he can regain his princehood he will be unstoppable, when in reality that power was never even taken from him. He is still the same person after all, and sealed himself away. It's the fact that he doesn't see the power in himself already which is preventing him from grasping it. Akio is eager to insist that everyone he controls is taking actions of their own free will, even though his entire operation is about manipulating that will. It's not that he's necessarily wrong to say that Anthe is acting on her own will, but where does one develop their will? No one is born with awareness of every possibility facing them, or even nearly in comprehension of what they all could be capable of. They have to learn about those things, and if the person teaching them is constantly boxing them into a specific paradigm of behavior and possibility, then can that really be called acting on their own free will? Akio wants to win this debate on a technicality, but this kind of rigid adherence to the prescribed meaning of language turns a blind eye to the spirit of the construction of that language. It is in this way that definitions can often become authoritative, and that pervades everything right back down to, most powerfully again, the male and female identities. If Anthe is really acting on her own free will, then acting on your own free will is nothing to be proud of, and not a defense for Akio. It is very obvious that he is exerting power over her and everyone else around him, and that even if they do contain within them the possibility to reject that power, it isn't a possibility that they are going to exercise when they have no understanding of how to do so, and blinders being placed on them to avoid seeing it. Ironically, a few things which Akio is completely correct about, he lacks self-awareness about as well. In one instance, he tells Mikage that there are no outsiders here, and this fact I'd like taught in school. No matter what, when you're here on Earth, you're here with everyone else that's here, and any decision you make has a rippling effect that they are included in. Akio appreciates that everyone is important, yet he thinks that he therefore needs to position himself as the most important and in control because, again, he lacks enough faith in anyone else to work with them. He says later of Mikage that as long as he remains in that closed garden called school, he will never grow up, somehow seemingly oblivious to the fact that he himself has remained at school equally unchanging and unaging. This is the best way to see how the school functions as a metaphor for authoritative social structure in general. As long as you allow the structure to be your protection from your individual decision making, you will never really become an individual. If ever there were a time when Akio understood himself the least, it would be when he talks about the stars. He spends most of his time in a planetarium, despite claiming to not really even care about space at all. To him, the moon is merely a pointless thing that is nice to look at. The stars, he says, are owned by no one, and yet he is constantly mentioning his desire to name one. Akio wants to own something that you cannot own using the power of language. But no matter how many times he insists that Utena is nothing more than his rose bride, in the end it's a will that she doesn't even have the language to put into words, which she places all of her faith in, and whose power leads her to victory. Even if it's a battle which Utena herself doesn't realize she's fighting until the very end of the show, I'm tempted to describe the main thrust of this series as a battle between Akio and Utena for the soul of Anthe Himamiya. In this battle, Akio has the upper hand, as he's been with Anthe from the very beginning, and his cynicism could be said to have sprung from her in the first place. After all, Akio would have just fought himself to death and been a martyr if Anthe hadn't saved him. but it's not like I could fault her for hoping for a better way, especially when she's the one who's taking the beating for it for eternity. Anthe has less reason than anyone to place any faith in humanity, considering that her own consciousness is at this point split between a little girl who's being tortured forever for trying to protect mankind's former savior, and her physical existence is helping Akio to try and gain back his former power in the only way he thinks he can. It's really no surprise that she'd play along in Akio's plan, probably even more cynical than he is about the possibility of anyone being able to change the world at all. Anthe's distrust in humanity is pretty much core to her personality and all of the decisions she makes. Because she doesn't place any hope on anyone's ability to help her, she simply does whatever her brother tells her to do, manipulating and lying to the people who care about her, even if she cares about them as well, simply because she thinks they're going to lose anyways. Even still, I think it's fair to say that Anthe is the smartest character in the cast, even more so than her brother. So much so that she can keep her real feelings a secret from everyone, including him and maybe even herself. It's a joy to watch the way that she messes around with smaller-minded people like my other favorite character Nanami, and how all of the allowance she has for time unbeholden to the people who think they're controlling her is spent on very personal and particular pursuits. It is heartbreaking to think how the abuse at the hands of duelists like Saionji or even the weekly raping from her brother may well be nothing in the face of how much suffering she's been through, but it manifests the most in her antisocial behavior, how she describes things like everyone's faces becoming the same when she's in a large crowd. She is a woman with problems that she well and truly believes are better not shared with anyone else, and thus turns to the arts or communication with animals to express herself. Even still, her attitude is thick with inauthenticity. It's painfully obvious that she wants to believe in Utena, and that she prefers to be with her more than anyone else. It is with Utena that she gets to experience freedom of expression and lifestyle to some degree, even if she will only do so with the excuse that it's what her betrothed wishes of her. Anthe is too cowardly to place legitimate faith in Utena, and so lies to and manipulates her continually, taking her lack of curiosity and inability to figure things out for herself as indication of her weakness. But Anthe's weakness is that very lack of trust. There's a period in the back end of the show where she so obviously wants to feed Utena clues about what's really going on, but seems to think that if Utena can't figure it out for herself, then she was never worthy, because Anthe also isn't looking for a teammate but a savior. She has already consigned herself to powerlessness and doesn't even consider what she and Utena could do together if they both had all of the information. Of course, this isn't to say that Anthe is just being cruel. In fact, it's her sympathy for Utena and desire to keep her from destroying herself which propels some of this. She would rather see Utena simply give up and live on than to martyr herself to Anthe's cause. Anthe's lowest moment may well be when she tells Utena that she wishes they could all have stayed like this forever. To suggest this implies that this is the best she believes things will ever get. Servitude to Akio, constant abuse, and a manipulative relationship with her only friend is not an end state worth fighting for, but it's the best she's yet had or can imagine. She tries to push Utena away through betrayal by consuming the last of her innocence in the final hour, and then, in failing that, she just outright tries to kill herself so that there'll be nothing left for Utena to throw herself away fighting for. In the end, though, Utena overpowers her and Akio both, and in the light of that sacrifice, there is nothing left for Anthe to doubt. As Akio remains to wilt in his castle, Anthe moves on to reclaim Utena in whichever form she must remain, in pity of the man telling him to go ahead and continue rotting in the coffin he's built for himself. Utena is kind of a fucking moron. The evidence to this fact is insurmountable and often hilarious, but my favorite examples are the more esoteric ones, such as a scene in which she keeps misinterpreting Miki's attempts to explain artistic ideas because she simply has no artistic sense whatsoever, or when even her dumbass is at least smart enough to recognize how ridiculous Nanami is being when she wears the cowbell, yet manages to lose in a verbal confrontation over the subject because Nanami flips it back on her by calling her boy's uniform weird, and Utena just takes the bait with no proper comeback. Her particular brand of ignorance is such that she simply has no curiosity where she should. She doesn't know how to ask questions, doesn't assume that there's anything more to the circumstances surrounding her than meets the eye, and certainly doesn't even understand herself. Her insistence that she is obviously a girl and expectation to be treated as such even though she's wearing a boy's uniform isn't wrong, but it's definitely confusing, as though she hasn't exactly processed why anyone would question this fact beyond the fact that it just isn't what everyone else is doing. as if social norms in her mind spring from nowhere and just kind of exist for no reason. Which, of course, is her strength. If she had come to those conclusions through logic, we wouldn't even have a show here. Utena would just be a totally self-actualized person who tore through everyone else's hypocrisy like it was nothing. It's only because she doesn't actually understand the mechanism behind normalcy, or even really why she behaves the way that she does, answering the question of why she dresses as she does so often with "because I like it, I guess," that she is open to have that understanding filled in incorrectly. This is why everyone in the show who understands even basic psychology, be they Toga, Akio, or Anthy, manipulates her easily. Some of the moments in which I love Utena the most are when she responds to each of the episodic shadow plays during the Black Rose Society arc. Each of the characters in this arc are burdened by social perception. They can't get what they want because they're hung up on some problem of their identity or how they will be understood by others. Utena has never had to deal with this because the opinions of others have never even entered her mind. Showing up to school in a boy's uniform has immediately pulled her out of the social structure entirely and made her a standalone entity, something I relate to fiercely as a guy who looked so weird in high school that no one would even approach me. In response to the plight of these puppets, she always bluntly suggests an easy, obvious, and very reasonable fix which only requires thinking outside of the paradigm of perception and just doing what makes sense. Utena would probably think that anything other than pragmatism was just insanity, before realizing that everyone is insane. It's because she doesn't get that she's so easily prone to projection. It's hilarious that she regards her friend Wakaba as exceptionally normal, even though speaking to or admiring Utena at all places her in the abnormal category to some extent already, which is why during their duel, Wakaba lays it out flat that Utena would never be able to understand her experience. Just as Utena can't understand her friend's feelings of normalcy, she can't even begin to grasp the concept of Anthy having circumstances under which behaving as the Rose Bride could be preferable to something else. She assumes that Anthy requires saving, only to be put on her ass in the first arc, and then simply coming to the conclusion that she wants Anthy to be free just to put her own mind at ease, she fights to get her back, still never even asking why Anthy might want to be the Rose Bride, because she can't even conceive of there being a reason. Since Utena hasn't really thought through her own identity, she easily contradicts herself. Somehow she can be so aggressive towards others wanting her to be more normal, yet can also be aggressive to others for being weird in ways which she doesn't accept. She's made her own lines in the sand about which rules are good and which ones are not good without exploring the logic behind those gut reactions. When Akio tells her that innocence can hurt people, I wonder if he realizes how many times it's gotten her into trouble socially already. Because Utena has dedicated herself so much to saving other people, she doesn't really think enough about what they could do for her or even for themselves. Akio is not wrong to compare her to his former self, who thinks that they need to take on all of the pain in the world and can't possibly be worried about themselves. It is revealed at one point that part of Utena's promise to her prince was that she would be strong from now on and wouldn't cry anymore, as though expressing a need for help were in itself a weakness. In the end, though, she's the one who admits to Anthy that the time she spent with her was the first time that she was ever truly happy. It's not her desire to protect the weak that allows her to make the final sacrifice, but her desire to protect something which she herself requires to be happy, an open hand stretched towards teamwork, belated though it may become. Much of the later portion of Revolutionary Girl Utena twists and turns through Utena's manipulation at the hands of Akio. We are witness to the many ways in which the ignorant can be tricked into believing things about themselves which they never did before by having more powerful words inflicted on them than the ones that they have for themselves, and having value placed onto those words. As the world surrounding Utena becomes more adult and morality more difficult to parse, her simple-minded values start to seem frivolous even to herself. She isn't capable of putting those beliefs into words, and so they seem unreal and intangible, whereas Akio offers her good-sounding aphorisms that plausibly make sense of the world. Her memories can be toyed with in this way as well, since, as I mentioned earlier, memories are inherently fallible. People like to imagine that memories exist as data in a solid state inside of our minds, but the reality is that they are reconstructed from context clues every single time that they are recalled, and will often transform dramatically over a long enough time, sometimes solidifying into something of a smiley-face rendition of what actually happened. Utena can hardly remember the past, and so she can hardly justify why her memories are so important to her, or what they actually meant. As long as someone can rewrite those memories into something plausible for her to grasp onto as meaning, she will end up changing her mind accordingly. Likewise, the lack of definition given to her convictions makes them easier to reshape. At one point, Akio has Toga buy her a pair of earrings as a gift, cynically describing her as someone who carries around a ring from a man she knows nothing about just because she thinks it must have been important. Even though Utena doesn't think these earrings suit her and might have been offended at the purchase normally, the fact that she's receiving them from someone she's in love with and whom she defers to as a source of knowledge and is being egged on by her friends to believe that they are something great causes her to convince herself to like a pair of earrings which Akio didn't even approve the purchase of on the basis that he supposedly gave them to her. Nothing but a pile of lies, accepted because she never questioned it. Through all of this pummeling manipulation, Akio eventually gets Utena to lose her grip on what she was ever fighting for in the first place. The only thing which keeps her grounded through to the end of the duels is the continued need to protect Anthe, and so once she's freed Anthe from the role of the Rose Bride and then been betrayed by her immediately afterwards, there is no foundation left to her sense of purpose. But this has happened once before, to a lesser extent, at the end of the first arc, and inevitably Utena comes to the same conclusion as she did then. What matters the most is just simply the fact that she can pare all this back and recognize she was the happiest when she and Anthe were together. Utena manages to remain the hero of the story because she always remembers love, if nothing else. She always comes back to the conclusion that love will be worth fighting for, even if she has to die for it. Nothing can stop her from that, no matter how much innocence is lost or how scary it is to not understand what's going on. She always goes on believing that there is a good life for Anthe out there, and she won't stop the buck at anything short of the right answer. While the more central themes that I've talked about so far pervade the entire series, Revolutionary Girl Utena manages a decent level of breadth by refracting those core ideas through a variety of lenses, represented in its other major and minor characters. Each of their struggles is connected to those of the Triforce characters, but adds the kind of extra detail which defines human individuality and causes us to not all literally be the same person, or even ostensibly similar, even if our goals are close to the same. Toga is the guy that every guy wants to be, the alpha male at the top of the food chain, taking his pick of every woman he feels like and manipulating the respect of everyone, even though he's really doing it from a perch of cynical manipulation. He's as charismatic as it gets and uses his total understanding of everyone around him to convince them into doing what he wants, yet he's also the worst kind of guy, at least at first. That is before Utena shatters the foundation of his belief and convinces him that all of this power shouldn't be used just in service of himself. Toga is searching for purpose, and he finds it in Utena when he realizes that he doesn't completely understand her. She represents a new possibility, a challenge, something that will break the mold of his boring time making easy work of the people around him. At first, he thinks he'll be satisfied just by treating this as one more game that he needs to win, but when he realizes that he can't actually break Utena's will, he is lost again, and comes back only to send people to battle against her. Either it will turn out that Akio, the true alpha whom even Toga bows to, was right all along, and Utena should become his ultimate puppet, or he will have built her into the only thing that can stop Akio. In their final battle, he makes the stakes as high as possible. Should he win, he will protect her by making her his possession, but if her will is better than his, then he will place his faith in her and try to tell her something that will help her win. One of Toga's statements early on is key to understanding how he and Akio justify their manipulations. Toga believes that if someone gets their feelings hurt by him, then it was that person's own fault for having feelings which could be hurt. In a way, he's not wrong, but to act on that belief is exactly what it means to be an asshole. Because, of course, if you hurt other people, they are going to hate you. It's easy enough to trample all over everyone as long as you can stay at the top, but as soon as you're not there anymore, you won't have any allies remaining, and no one is at the top forever. If anything rescues Toga's soul, it's the realization that he really is sincerely in love with Utena, and from that position he can comfortably be the bad guy for a little while longer, so long as he knows he's doing it in some bizarre way for someone else's sake. Like all of the other student council members, when he's been beaten at the height of his game, there is nothing left but to admit that his ideals were not as powerful as Utena's, and to back her as the hero who will represent them all in the final battle. If Toga could be seen as the charismatic leader chosen by the people's admiration in ignorance of his manipulations, Nanami is more like corrupted royalty. At least she very much thinks herself the queen, ruling by intimidation and force, even though the only power she really has is in her siblinghood to her beloved brother. From her perspective, this connection makes her powerful, not only because she's in love with him and knows that he would just use and toss her aside if he could, but because in turn, she would be nobody without him. Another fly in the swarm, as she describes it, when her world is shattered by the false revelation that she was never really related to him in the first place. Where Toga's strength is in his ability to read other people on their own terms, Nanami is good at reading how people will bend themselves to fit into the social structure of so-called normalcy. Her weakness is that she completely believes in the world that she's crafted as reality, and struggles to conceive of how anyone could act out of other interests than being widely loved and respected. The idea that someone would be appreciated for the things which make them unique is alien to her, even though she doesn't realize that her insane devotion to upholding the structure of her system is weird as hell in itself. The worst case scenario in her mind is being made fun of or treated like an outsider, even though she spends so much time doing exactly that to other people that she's acutely aware of every single way it can be done to her. Her slavery to appearances is so powerful that even regular people can see it isn't normal. No one else is approaching their appearance in such an obsessively constructed way, so they can even tell when it goes awry. Nevertheless, it seems like much of Nanami's idiocy can be tied to her youth. Since she's always trying to read people and get to the heart of their intentions for the sake of taking control over them, she does notice things which Utena doesn't, and becomes enraged with her lack of intellectual curiosity. Nanami knows when she's out of her depth, even if she's also comically prone to jump into conclusions way too quickly. Her sheer dedication to the things she cares about is admirable, and between that and her perceptiveness, I'd like to think she'll grow up to be a much better person. Or maybe that's just my projection based on the fact that I love her so much. It's easy to hate Saionji on account of him being a terrible person in so many obvious ways, but it's a testament to Utena's construction how he can still manage to become somewhat endearing and entertaining to watch, both for making fun of him and for some legitimate strengths in his character. He is defined by a desire to chase a very immature masculine ideal, and in particular to come out of Toga's shadow as the alpha male. But whereas Toga has achieved respect and love by way of understanding people, Saionji only recognizes his strength as something to be caught up with. He seems to believe that Toga just knows something he doesn't, and that he can figure it out himself just by becoming more powerful and taking more control. Saionji is so caught up in his own worldview that his conception of love is that of possessing a woman and sharing the depths of his heart with her. His heart, of course, being a centimeter deep, and without even attempting to interpret more about that woman than what she tells him, understanding so little about her that he can't even tell when her personality has done a complete 180 after switching bodies with Utena. In his mind, though, this is legitimately what love is, and it really does crush him to lose it, which is why it becomes so much fun to laugh at his earnestness in the face of his foolishness. There is a certain strength, though, in his pure desire to be his own man, as he's the only one who won't let himself be manipulated by Akio in the end. He doesn't want to be a passenger in anyone's life, but also hasn't conceived of how he can, as an individual, team up with someone by sharing mutual respect. If he only understood that relationships don't have to be a power game and that he only needs to treat others the way he expects to be treated, his dedication to self-betterment and strength of ideals could lead him to greatness. Miki is someone who thinks in art but is obsessed with logic. He is constantly trying to quantify something about himself which isn't quantifiable because he doesn't realize that it's an attribute of himself. Instead, he projects it onto the people in his life, as though they somehow give him an inner magic that he can't achieve alone. Historically, he attributed his incredible skill at piano to the fact that he used to play with his younger sister in a sunlit garden, and has obsessed over this memory for so long that it's become a total fabrication. Kozue, it turns out, was never even good at piano in the first place, but Miki was convinced that he was only great when he was with her. Without even realizing it, Miki is able to understand esoteric emotional ideas which wouldn't even be thought of as logical if they didn't have words for them, as evidenced in a conversation where he refers to things like Anthy's piano being just like his sister's, which Utena interprets to mean the literal piano rather than Anthy's playing. When Anthy says arigato, he hears it as a passage from a song, visualized in the sheet music itself. Yet because he's so far from realizing the uniqueness of his own mind, he's always trying to force the sound to come out as he wants it. Toga remarks at one point how, after he's filled the so-called hole in his life with his projection of Anthy, his playing flows more naturally, whereas before he'd played too forcefully. The evidence of Miki's wrongheadedness comes through in his duel with Juri, wherein he criticizes himself for a less than perfect performance, even though Juri insists that he was actually doing better than usual precisely because his moves weren't so rigidly trying to be perfect. One metaphorical way to characterize Miki's problem is an overzealousness towards masculine ideals. He seems to look up to Toga, as most of the boys in the series do, and wants to be a very logically driven person, even though everyone remarks how they prefer him as a gentle, effeminate, and emotional piano player. It's because he needs to project his ideals of femininity onto women that he can't find them in himself. His memory of Kozue is completely off base, and she's made sure he's damn well aware of that by toying with him constantly. But instead of dwelling on her, he's already gone ahead and sought a replacement, noticing that Anthy is ostensibly the very type of woman that his sister's memory seemed to be, and assuming everything about her that fits into his personal narrative. Eventually, he is convinced to try and take what he wants, contradictions be damned, but only while he's being duped by his sister, who's just looking for one more excuse to trap his eyes on her by making out with his prized Rose Bride. It's at this moment that I must confess the incompleteness of my reading of this show, in that I struggle to interpret or connect to much of Juri's character. It's clear that she's living with blinders on, clinging to a sense of self which doesn't actually represent her well. She thinks she has no choice but to be in love with Shiori and that she has to suffer for it. She thinks she has to put on this performance of being an unflappable badass with power over everyone around her, even though in reality she is too weak and cowardly to actually change the situation she's stuck in. But honestly, I can tell there's more to this than I really get. I mean, I can interpret some of the people around Juri easier than I can her herself, and while yes, I know plenty has been written about both her and everything and everyone else in this show, the point of this video has never been a comprehensive dive into Utena. Such a thing would go on eternally, but just a collection of notes that I've taken from the show. So, this is a gap in my knowledge. In the Black Rose Society arc, action is driven by a set of side characters most important to each of the main duelists, whose personality deficiencies hold some sort of mirror up to their counterparts. Whereas each of the student council members is fighting to achieve something, the darker shades are fighting to destroy. They've hit rock bottom and are desperate for whatever drastic measures might have a chance at ending their suffering. Their representative leader, Mikage, is a man driven by an obsession with a false memory, corrupted by his desire for purpose. A man once described as a living computer has tried to become a mad scientist in the name of protecting something that never existed. His followers are all similarly pathetic, based on assumptions of who they are and what situations they find themselves in. Perhaps the most powerful of them all is Nanami's supposed friend, who actually finds the inner strength to realize that she doesn't have to consider herself lesser or succumb to social pressure to pursue her desires, and even takes Nanami down a peg in the moments when Nanami is weak enough to not be able to kick her ass. Most of these I'm not so interested in talking about, but Wakaba is important, both because she's the most consistent side character in the show, and her mirror is held mostly to Utena, representing Utena's conception of total normalcy, but also hating this aspect of herself the most. Wakaba has no love for normalcy. After all, she follows around the weirdest girl at her school and is offended when she tries to act more normal, even though everyone else in school likes her better that way. She tells her this brand of normal isn't your kind of normal because she respects people based on who they actually are and not who they try to appear to be. And yet she herself, without trying, appears plain. Utena likes this about her, but Wakaba can't be comfortable with it because she believes it closes her off from being someone special, who can actualize her best self and pursue the special people that she admires. When she has Sayonji living in her house, the confidence boost she gains from feeling special makes her better at everything, even though Sayonji has nothing to do with it. If she could just teach herself to perceive the fact that she's capable of these things regardless, then she wouldn't need anyone to make her feel this way. But Wakaba doesn't see romanticism in herself. She has to project it onto others. She has this memory of a boy acting as her prince, even though it was entirely her who declared him to be the prince and he had nothing to do with it, and she even relishes in this memory in spite of him, willing to project that romantic ideal onto someone else entirely. Projections, assumptions, and memories being used as the basis for self-identity are everyone's weakness in Revolutionary Girl Utena. They are the common threads tying all of these people together. Then you have Ruka, who I'm inclined to believe is intentionally based on Kaoru from Evangelion. I say this because he kinda looks like Kunihiko Ikuhara himself, and Ikuhara has speculated that Kaoru was based on him because of an interaction he had with Anno in a hot tub. The way that this character shows up out of nowhere is immediately massively important and then dies off as quickly as he came in the show's 11th hour certainly draws a strong parallel. Anyways, Ruka has just one line of dialogue that I find incredibly important. He says to Juri of Shiori that she doesn't understand that miracles require sacrifice, yet miracles only ever come to people like her. There is so much irony in this statement. It's a tacit admission that miracles do exist and can happen without sacrifice, yet also states that in order to make one happen, a sacrifice is necessary. Ruka is acting in desperation. He's sacrificing himself for Yuri in the short time that he has left because he can't conceive that things will go well if he doesn't make them. It's a struggle of faith, which speaks all the way back to Akio's biggest problem in the first place, that he thinks it's impossible for the revolution to come from a position of faith in humanity, and that the only way to make it happen is through control. Much of what is explored in Revolutionary Girl Utena doesn't really require analysis so much as observation. The series has a lot to say about the cruelty in siblinghood, for instance, how close proximity between two people in their early years will shape them in so many complicated ways for better and worse, and inexorably tie them, and it pulls no punches with how it will plunge the depths of what traumas that can lead to, even touching heavily on the subject of incest. But there's nothing really for me to read into there. The show lays out its points plainly in the dialogue. What I mostly took away from Utena was a meditation on the non-existence of and evils of projected normalcy. Everyone in this show has their own situation, their own unique strengths and weaknesses, hang-ups and failures, and yet very few of them wear all of those things on their sleeves. Perhaps Utena wouldn't if she were less ignorant of her own failings, which are in fact her ignorance, but everyone else is either trying to cover something up so they can fit into the social system that they've crafted, or is misunderstanding something about themselves because of how it doesn't fit into that system as they understand it. We're shown how so-called normiedom and adulthood comes when you abandon your childhood promise to yourself to make the world a better place at any cost. It comes when your fear of death, or even just being hated, causes you to kowtow to someone else's narrative. And it proves just how easy it is to fall for the trick, how the offer of comfort and stability and something easy to understand with a clear definition will erode the foothold of your ideals. It challenges a notion proposed by one of the characters that when everyone around you is impure, you have no choice but to become impure yourself, and instead preaches the pursuit of will to power, even in the face of an overwhelming and evil will. In one of the last episodes, Juri tells a story about a boy who jumped into the river to save her drowning sister, but ended up dying himself. She regrets how, even after she looked down on her sister for forgetting his name, she has also forgotten it. Utena's sacrifice is largely unseen. Her name will be forgotten and her deeds never really understood. Akio will keep perpetuating his evil system, and the other characters will continue having to struggle to fix their own flaws in their lives. But Anthe, the one who Utena loves, has at least been given hope. She has made the choice to leave her suffering and to seek love once more in finding Utena wherever her soul may have gone. If you think of revolution as a totalizing shift encompassing the world and changing everyone, you won't find it. Revolution is in inspiring others to do what's right for themselves, one soul at a time. The end of the road need not come in sacrifice. It need not come in radicalization or in perfect order wrought by one man's ideals. It will only come at the end of a long and arduous process of turning every single heart to love. An act of faith, unwavering in the face of death. The pendulum will swing back and forth forever, so all that's left is to ask yourself a simple question. Is my love worth dying for?